Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. My name is Guy Lamb. For those of you who don't know me, I'm with the Safety and Violence Initiative at the University of Cape Town and the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University. Welcome to this week's SaferSpaces webinar. SaferSpaces has been holding a number of webinars over the past few months, focusing on crime prevention, violence prevention, policing, safety discussions, focusing specifically on Southern Africa. And this is, I think, our 7th or 8th webinar that we've had this year. So thank you so much for making the time to be here. I know there are lots of different webinars that are happening all the time. So people's time and attention is often pulled towards webinars, and you often are quite spoiled for choice when it comes to webinars. So thank you for making the time for being here. We're very fortunate today because we're going to be focusing on public order policing within South Africa, looking at the challenges and the current state of affairs of public order policing in South Africa. And we're very lucky to have two eminent persons in this particular sector, Adele Kirsten from Gun Free South Africa, and David Bruce, who's an independent researcher who is also based at Wits University as well. He does some work there and some teaching too. Both of them were members of a panel of experts that was commissioned and initiated by government after the Farnham Commission of Inquiry that looked into the Marikana massacre, and was a recommendation of that Commission of Inquiry that a panel of experts be convened to look at the state of public order policing and how it should be reformed in South Africa. So the report was produced, and it's certainly been sitting on government's inbox for a number of years, but fortunately the Minister of Police a few weeks ago publicly released this report. So it's now in the public domain. It has a number of really interesting and very useful recommendations on what needs to happen in terms of improving public order policing within South Africa. But without any further ado, we're going to jump in here. This is, as to say, the title of this particular webinar is From Tatane to Ntumba, which is focusing, it's been more than 10 years since Andries Tatane's death at the hands of public order police in Vicksburg and the Free State. And we've had many other incidences involving individuals dying or being injured by police in the context of public order policing. And we had the more recent episode of Ntumba in Braamfontein during university student protests in Braamfontein. And he was walking past and was shot with rubber rounds and died as a result of police action. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. The first speaker today is going to be Adele Kirsten. Adele is going to be focusing specifically on the less lethal weapons and ammunition side of aspect of things. And then we're going to hand over to David, and David's going to be talking about the context and the challenges. So over to you, Adele.
Hi, thanks, Guy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being part of our discussion this afternoon. I mean, I guess there's really a huge amount to say about the use of less lethal weapons in the policing and managing of crowds. And you know, there are lots of different views on it, both in terms of the actual use of the weapon, as well as the context in which these weapons are used. And there are lots of issues around the manufacturing of these devices. And I think what's less often discussed is some of the kind of ethical, social, and political dilemmas that the use of these weapons raise. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm going to hone in on what the panel of experts report says about the use of less lethal weapons. And I'm going to look at three things. One is I'm going to talk a little bit about terminology and the evolution of the use of these weapons in the kind of policing context. And then I'm going to speak specifically about the less lethal weapons used by the public order police in South Africa, some of the risks associated with these weapons, as well as what some of the recommendations are in the panel report. And then to end with really, I guess, raising some kind of questions in terms of what are the solutions, what is the sort of best way forward. So I'm going to start with the issue of terminology. And terminology is really important. It matters. It's important that we are using a term that most accurately describes the weapons that are used by police and law enforcement agencies in the management of crowds, not just in South Africa, but across the world. So just some quick background on their history. And I'm not sure how much, the people in the room, how much you know about this. So I want to do a summary rather than go into too much detail, because there's a lot of detail to go into. But I think an important point to note is that many of these weapons, like stun grenades, the rubber rounds, tear gas canisters, they were most often first used by military in conflicts. But these weapons have been used in different contexts across the world for at least the last 80 years. And in fact, the first known use of water cannons was in Germany in the early 1930s. You saw the use of tear gas, for example, in Vietnam, and then stun grenades in the 60s and 70s. And these are known, those weapons are known as first generation less lethal weapons. And it's from the early 1960s that we begin to see the use of these weapons by law enforcement agencies and police across the world. And then in the early 90s, you see this exponential kind of increase in the interest of the weapons, but also in the production of these weapons. And for many people, so for example, the Patton report talks about how the introduction of these weapons into law enforcement and for the use in crowd control fundamentally altered the policing landscape, and especially with regard to the use of force. And for many, this was a positive development because it was seen as providing the law enforcement agencies with a much broader range of equipment, and so more choices for commanders, and therefore less reliance on the use of lethal force. And so I think that's one area for discussion in terms of where we are now on this issue. But what this means, this kind of exponential increase in the production and the demand for these weapons, is that there's very little publicly available information on how they should be used. There is very limited information on the negative health impacts. And I guess a really important recent document, which is called Lethal in Disguise, by INCLO, which stands for the International Network of Civil Liberties Organization. We have got much more information on the health impacts of both the use and the misuse of these weapons. And then, of course, the potential for the misuse of these weapons. I think there's not enough data. And in part, that is because the manufacturers provide very little information on potential, defective production, but also law enforcement agencies across the globe also collect very little information, not just on the use of these weapons, but also on their misuse. And so there's not a kind of a body of work that enables, or research that enables one to assess in what context are these weapons most appropriate and then not appropriate. So I guess just to touch on the names that are used, they started off by being regarded as non-lethal because coming from a military kind of context, they were certainly seen, it's not lethal ammunition in the sense of a 9mm weapon or an assault rifle. But then words like crowd control weapons, which is very common in the European context, less than lethal is the other name. And the name that most often is used right now currently is less lethal weapons. And it is the recommendation that was made by the panel that this is the name. This is how this class of weapons must be referred to by SAP. So it's recommendation 91 in the panel report, and that the term less lethal weapons must be used across the standard the standard operating procedures in national instruction as well as in training. And I guess the reason it's important to get the name right is that for police officers, it's particularly important to recognize that the weapons they are using have the potential to cause injury and in some instances death. So this notion that it's non-lethal creates an attitude and a climate that these are safe to use at close range in dispersing crowds. The name suggests less lethal, that with improper use, with misuse, if the device is defective, that there is a risk for injury and, as we know in the South African context, death. So really important to get agreement, I guess, globally. And the United Nations have defined less lethal weapons as weapons that are designed and mainly employed to incapacitate personnel and material while minimizing fatality. So the purpose of these weapons is to incapacitate, is to disable people in a crowd, but they are not meant to be used necessarily as a crowd dispersal mechanism. Just finally, before going on to the kind of specific less lethal weapons used in South Africa by our POP units, is there are a number of recommendations made in the panel report, which looks at the kind of the context that I referred to earlier of rapid manufacturing and production of these weapons and insufficient guidelines on things like what we call pre-deployment testing. Is that there needs to be much more thorough testing of the weapon before it's put into the market for sale, and that this information needs to be made available. There's also a recommendation that SAPS needs to only procure less lethal weapons based on need. And thirdly, that there needs to be an independent verification process of once, so for example, once SAPS has procured a less lethal weapon, that they are required to test it, which they currently say that they do. What the panel recommends is that there's an independent verification process to test the weapon. So these are kind of recommendations, I guess, that who's going to track this, and how do we make sure that some of these recommendations are actually taken on board. So now to look at what less lethal weapons SAPS does use, the public order policing units. And I think it's important to understand that the weapons issued to POP members are contained within National Instruction 4 of 2014 under Section 12, but it includes the equipment. So the weapons are seen as part of, in a way, the equipment that POP members have in order for them to effectively do their job. And of course, the equipment includes things like the shield, their helmet, the body armor, and the tonfas, which for most of us means a baton. And then the three specific less lethal weapons that are issued to POP members is the tear gas canister, a stun grenades, and then the shotgun and rubber bullets. The fourth one is, of course, water cannons, but that would be for the platoon rather than obviously for individual POP members. And I think the important thing to remember is that all police officers, this is not as part of their POP duties, this is part of their duty as a regular police officer. They all have their 9mm sidearm, the official issue, and of course ammunition with them. Although it's expressly prohibited for a live ammunition to be used in the management of crowds, I just think it's important to note that that weapon is there in that context. So I'm going to look quite, I think just to add that under National Instruction 4, it's not clear, there's lack of clarity on exactly how and when some of these less lethal weapons can be used, except specifically with regard to tear gas as well as rubber bullets. The instruction says that it may only be used under command. There's no such guideline actually around stun grenades, and we'll get to that. So I'm going to look at the four most commonly used weapons by POP units, and this is shared globally across law enforcement agencies. So the first is the water cannon, and I think for many of us, certainly not protesters who are at the receiving end of the water cannon, but at first glance it looks like a relatively harmless device, but it is categorized as a less lethal weapon. It's used indiscriminately, and one of the kind of real gaps is that there is right now no publicly available guidelines, and the kinds of guidelines one would want to be looking at is what is the amount of pressure. So, for example, I mean, the purpose of the cannon is that it delivers a blast of high velocity pressured water. It seems that mostly it's around 15 bar. And just to give you an example, your shower head is about 3 bar. But there's no publicly available guidelines on the amount of pressure or the minimum distance. And there's very scarce medical literature on the potential negative impact. So we don't really know what some of the kind of unintended or intended consequences are. And we make, and obviously there are the issues of putting chemicals in the water and dye. I mean, those of you who were around in the 80s, you remember the Purple People Shall Govern. Purple dye was used in protest in Cape Town in the late, like around about 89. And that's a way of marking your protesters so you can identify who you want to try and target to remove. Then the other weapon are tear gas, and I think it's quite useful to call them by their technical name, which is chemical irritants, because I think it immediately tells you what the aim of the weapon is, and it's really to irritate the senses. I think there's general agreement across the community, global community that engages with this issue, that it's an inherently indiscriminate weapon. And that although, in the national instruction for POP units, it says only under command, and it's very clear you may not discharge it in a confined area that needs to be able to spread. But the reality is once the tear gas canister has been discharged, and often it does get discharged from a launcher, it doesn't always just get thrown, you can't stop the spread of the chemical, and you have very little control over its negative effects or it affecting unintended targets. So, for example, people with asthma, you don't know if there are people suffering from asthma in the crowd, young children, elderly, and issues such as overexposure. One of the interesting pieces of research done by Omega found that, and this is mainly across the European states, is that in the majority of instances, they found that tear gas was deployed in partially enclosed or confined spaces. And again, whether that's a deliberate misuse or whether it's the context, officers being panicking and discharging without not under command, but also not thinking through very carefully. So one of the recommendations the panel made was that there should be a standard concentration of gas. So, again, quite a guideline, what I would see as a relatively doable and quite mild recommendation. The third weapon is your stun grenade, known as a disorientation device. And again, the aim is to cause panic and disorientation. It's often called a flashbang device, and that's a very good name for it because it comes with a very loud kind of bang and a bright light, a bright flash before it's discharged. And of course, here there are a number of challenges, is instances of misfiring. If you have a defective grenade, things like shrapnel, which can cause serious injury. burns, and of course with the bang, potential injury for things like hearing. So these are some of the potential negative impacts. And the panel recommends that because there are just absolutely no regulations and no guidelines on the use of these stun grenades under National Instruction 4. And we also recommend that alternatives to stun grenades get explored. So what you'll see in these recommendations, and I see my time's running out, but I want to get to the rubber bullets, is that the recommendations focus really on two kind of aspects of control. The one is managing the weapon. So putting in place kind of standardized things like the concentration of the water pressure, the concentration of the chemical in the tear gas canister. So it's about managing the weapon. And then I guess the second common recommendation is managing the use of these weapons by POP members, always under strict command. So let's get to the last weapon, which I think is the weapon that is most known by South Africans and certainly by protesters. It's a weapon that is very feared. And this is the rubber bullets and shotgun. And their proper name is kinetic impact projectiles. And they often referred to as rubber rounds or rubber bullets. And they obviously always need a launcher, which is usually in the South African instance a 12-gauge shotgun. Now, the materials of the rounds vary. They can be plastic, wood, metal, hard foam. So POP uses 2 rubber rounds fired from a shotgun in a cartridge. And they are often actually fired using a lethal firearm platform as well, such as, the 12-gauge shotgun, of course, and then an R5. So there are a real number of challenges with this weapon, in that they are designed to incapacitate and inflict pain without the projectile actually penetrating the skin. But the rubber rounds are unlike traditional bullets, is that they have a tumbling effect. They don't have a direct forward movement. And this tumbling effect causes them to lose speed, which of course lessens the risk of penetrating injury, but it means that they lose accuracy. And in particular, that second round as it's discharged. And so part of this is there's this real tension between the people on the receiving end of this weapon and the people discharging the weapon. So you'll often hear cops say it's inaccurate, it's not the right weapon, and the only way they can disable someone is if they come to close range. Now, close range means 10 meters and under. But again, there's no regulation about there's no guideline on this is what close range is, or that it must be fired from 20 meters. So there's a lot of confusion, lack of clarity about what is the distance. But we know that the further away you are, the less accurate it becomes. But the closer you are, the more dangerous it becomes. And of course, the regulations are very clear. You fire from, below the waist. And of course, we know that Tatane and Ntumba were both killed because the weapon was discharged at close range in the upper body. So there's huge room for improvement here. There are, new generation rounds, which are called safe impact rounds, as well as what's called APEs, attenuated energy projectiles. These are recommended by international experts, and in fact, we made it one of our recommendations. Gary White, who was one of the expert witnesses at the Farlam Commission, says that they are much more effective option and have been used in Northern Ireland. So we drew on his work quite a lot, but that's a recommendation that POP explore that. And then other recommendations, I mean, around it is that adopting the principle of differentiation, which is that the use of rubber bullets is specifically to incapacitate an individual. So it's not a crowd dispersal weapon. It's to make sure that that someone who's seen as a kind of a key leader or it's about behaving violently. So it's not about taking out people who are organizing the protest, but it's about disabling someone who is potentially a threat in terms of the use of violence. One of the things that POP does is they do this thing called skip firing, where they fire the bullet first into the ground, and it's about reducing its velocity, but as I indicated, it reduces its accuracy. So one of the recommendations is that skip firing is discontinued, that the aim can only be at the lower body, and that these weapons can only be used under strict command. And so I guess the question, and I'm about to end for all of us is, do they form any utility? Even with strict guidelines, can they, are they an asset in part of the kind of equipment and options for POP members? And one of the questions is really, should they be banned?
Thanks. Is that the end of your presentation, Adele? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Adele. To save time, we're going to now move over to David Bruce, who's going to talk about the context of public order policing, about the kind of challenges that they're encountering, and we'll continue the conversation from Adele's presentation. So over to you, David. Adele, if you can just mute yourself.
Hi. Okay. Thanks, Guy, and thanks, Adele, and greetings to everyone. So I'm just I've got a presentation to share, so I'm just going to put my presentation up, and it'll take a few moments to do that. Hopefully only a few moments. So there we have it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there we go. So my job is to talk about the kind of broader context of public order policing and so on. I was also a member of the panel, and so my input is informed by my experience of working on the panel. I learned a considerable amount by being on the panel. And I would just say that I'm not really going to be discussing the panel report in any great detail, but talking about these questions in terms of, how do we think about them, and what is the kind of, how do we define the kind of problems here and how they need to be addressed. So obviously, in terms of context, in terms of our background, we could talk about a wide range of different things. The one thing is with April the 27th, just around the corner, it's of course important to reflect back on the fact that we're living in democratic South Africa under a constitution which provides a Bill of Rights. Inter alia, this Bill of Rights refers to rights to be protected against all forms of violence and not treated in a cruel, inhuman, or degrading way. People have a right to assemble peacefully and unarmed. There's socioeconomic rights which are supposed to be realized progressively. There's also a historical background which is specific to public order policing. One could refer to the passing of the Regulation of Gatherings Act in 1993. One of the things that is part of our framework for public order policing is the idea of negotiated crowd management. And then, as Adele has been talking about, one of the things aspects of the kind of transition to democracy has been this kind of institutionalization of this these less lethal weapons as part of public order policing. And then also in terms of the history of public order policing, and again, maybe for people who are not familiar with this, this is inadequate, but there was quite a strong investment in developing a specialized public order policing capacity in the late 1990s. For various reasons, this specialized public order policing capacity was kind of went into decline, particularly in the first decade of this millennium. And though there has been some, some resources and work put into kind of restoring its capacity, but we're living in the, in the kind of shadow of this kind of longer history. And then there's also these, various incidents which have received attention in, over the last decade and caused considerable concern, especially Marikana, though Marikana, the killings there were not at the hands of public order policing units, but the other deaths, which in some ways have been the most prominent ones, have been deaths at the hands of public order units, and there have been, a number of other deaths during crowd management incidents over the years. So then one could talk about, in terms of what are the challenges here, and so I'm not trying to provide a kind of definitive analysis here, but just, flagging some of the issues that might be seen as part of an analysis of the problem. The one thing which I'll talk about a bit more later on in the presentation is the idea that from the point of view of public order policing, we have a high conflict environment. So there's a large number of things that contribute to conflict within communities and elsewhere within educational institutions and so on. And so this places, in many situations, it places a lot of pressure at the end of the day on public order policing units to, in some ways, kind of resolve situations which, have their origins in certain kinds of social conflict. I do believe, and obviously this is one of these points that needs to be presented with a certain degree of nuance and so on, and I'm not going to try and present that nuance here, but I believe that to some degree there's a historical legacy in South Africa of acceptance of violent protests, and that that in some ways there's a kind of resort to violence in situations where people, for instance, haven't exhausted and haven't made a proper investment in resolving their grievances through non-violent means. But that might be a controversial point, but it nevertheless is my impression that that is part of the problem. There's issues to do with the regulatory framework, specifically, for instance, if we're talking about public order police, rubber bullets, as Adele alluded to, there isn't actually a specific regulatory framework in place which says to police, these are the standards that you need to uphold in relation to the use of these weapons. But more broadly, for instance, in relation to the Regulation of Gatherings Act and things like that, there's aspects where there's certainly need for improvement, and many of these issues are highlighted in the panel report. There's questions to do with equipment. So, for instance, Adele has talked partly about the questions to do with weapons. And so, for instance, she raised this issue of replacing the existing rubber bullets with alternative type of projectiles. But also, for instance, you could talk about the types of vehicles that are provided to public order police. You could talk about, for instance, things like their kind of protective equipment. And so, I mean, for instance, there's an issue of an accountability and whether the helmets that public order police sometimes wear should have an identifying number, so that where, for instance, you've got a video record of a public order policing incident, you can identify the individual police officers involved in the incident by a number on their helmets. There's questions to do with training, and one of the issues highlighted in the panel report is talked about there. There's issues about information on protest in South Africa. So it's one of the things that you will find every year is the SAPS produces an annual report where they have what is supposedly a figure on kind of levels of protest and on levels of violent protest. And there's some good analysis of this, which has been conducted by people at the University of Johannesburg, Kate Alexander, and so on, which shows that this isn't actually what the information reveals and deals with. And so actually then what you have is a situation where the public order policing system that we have in South Africa relies on a kind of information system, which in terms of the development of, information technology is completely outdated. So it was a system which was developed in the late 1990s. It's basically to a large degree useless in providing up-to-date information about kind of protest in South Africa. And so, one of the recommendations that the panel report makes is for, that in order to, have a proper responsive public order policing system, one needs to have a better information management system. And linked to that, there's a question about resources. So now, so for instance, the one big question in South Africa is a question about whether, for instance, we have adequate numbers of public order police and so on. The basic approach that, makes sense to me in relation to this question is that until we have much better information about the nature of the problem of protest in South Africa, it's very difficult for us to answer questions about, the types of public order policing resources that we need. Okay, so one can probably no doubt add to this list, but that gives you some of a sense of the challenges in this domain. Moving on then to analyzing then this problem at another level, what we have then is one could see that the problems in policing in South Africa are not simply problems of public order policing. One, for instance, has I mean, for instance, if one goes back to the 2012 National Development Plan, there's a focus within that on police leadership and on specifically, for instance, processes to do with the appointment of the National Commissioner. So one has this current situation where the president is authorized to simply kind of fairly arbitrarily appoint the National Commissioner of the South African Police Service. And now it's worth bearing in mind that the South African Police Service is an organization of close to 200,000 people. It has a budget of over 100 million rand. It is then, so possibly, as the SAPS is the largest organization in South Africa, and so one very clearly needs people at the most senior levels of this organization who've been very carefully selected, but nevertheless, indications are that the manner in which the National Commissioner is selected is, leaves a lot to be desired. So, but my understanding is that this tendency to focus on the issue as being a problem about the appointment of the national commissioner is a bit too narrow. What we have is essentially, and if one looks at Chapter 11 of the Constitution, it kind of provides the framework for the overall system of governance of the policing system in South Africa, and that includes the Minister of Police. It includes an institution known as the Civilian Secretariat for Police, which is supposed to be a mechanism for providing policy guidance to the national to the national minister, and then also it's supposed to include, and then it includes the national commissioner. Sorry, I've just got a bit of a distraction, but I'm going to focus from now on. So my understanding then, is that at the moment we do not have effective leadership and governance of the policing system. This overall system of leadership and governance is not providing effective management and leadership to the policing system. And so, for instance, we can focus on these, problems within public order policing. But the problem that, is a bigger problem within policing in South Africa. And so, within this overall system of leadership and governance is where we should be resolving these problems of public order policing. But at the moment, this system of governance is not doing the work that it needs to do. And so in many ways, what we've had in South Africa over the last 20 years is a kind of type of stagnation within the policing system. There's been kind of some superficial things that have been done. But insofar as we're looking to this kind of leadership system to provide kind of purposeful engagement with the problems of policing in South Africa, that simply hasn't been happening. And so, and similarly then, part of, and related to this, we can see problems in relation to the kind of mechanisms of accountability. And then alongside this, we have this type of high crime environment in which there's, for instance, problems of serious violent crime, there's problems of gender-based violence, there's problems of organized crime, there's this, problem of information technology and its use in crime, cybercrime. And so also what this creates then within the policing environment is quite a major kind of tension, because insofar as there is political pressure on the police, that political pressure is consistently on the police to address the crime problem. And quite often what this seems to, one of the consequences seems to be, is that it results in, for instance, resources being diverted away from public order policing. And so it's only in these moments, so when you have the death of Andries Tatane or the death of Mthokozisi Ntumba, that you then have this renewed interest in public order policing and, a lot of kind of focus on and talk about public order policing. But the broad kind of, the general trend within this environment is for the focus to be on strengthening the police response to crime. Okay, then moving, and this is just a quote. It comes from a review of an assistance project that was carried out by the British government to the policing system in Malawi. And so, sorry, so I'm just trying to see how I can read this. So anyway, I mean, you'll be able to read it. It's part of my Zoom is obscuring it, but it says something about strengthening subcomponents of the police such as victim support units, prosecutors, or public order, in the absence of broader institutional reform, has been demonstrated elsewhere to be a poor investment. If the police institution as a whole remains unreformed and suffers poor leadership and an inability to manage its human resources, then it will be, it won't be possible to bring about sustainable change in components such as public order policing. What I just wanted to also just flag here is that I've left in elements of the quote which I don't think are entirely relevant in South Africa. I don't think, within the South African context, I don't think it's reasonable to argue that the policing system is poorly resourced. The police budget is definitely one of the kind of bigger budget items on the public on government's list of expenses. And so, and I think also that to some degree the SAPS itself has reasonable systems of financial management. But I mean, I think nevertheless that the point that the quote speaks to is that, if one has problems within a component of the police, such as public order policing, these cannot necessarily be resolved unless one has kind of systems which at a higher level within organizations that respond to problems in a kind of purposeful way. Okay, so then we've talked about public order policing. We've talked about sort of more generalized problems within the policing system. But then what we can also need to acknowledge is that there's also, in many ways, our overall system of government is characterized by chronic problems of one kind or another. And so, it's a mistake to kind of oversimplify this problem, because it's not simply that we have a problem of weak government. In many ways, the problem is one of high levels of unevenness. So one has components of government which are relatively functional, but then one also has components which are characterized by chronic weaknesses. And, I could kind of labor the point, but we could talk about, manifestations of this in the area of education, of health, of provincial government, of local government, of the criminal justice system itself, and of state-owned enterprises. A quote from the newspaper this week was that it basically indicated that I think it was 53% of senior municipal officials in South Africa have minimum competency requirements. There's partly related to the Zondo Commission. There's quite a lot of attention being given to the problem of corruption in South Africa currently, but in many ways, corruption and this problem of poor and ineffective public administration are mutually reinforcing problems. And so, okay, so then, this is, and so in diagnosing this problem, again, there would be a question about what kind of conversation or discussion or concepts we would put forward in discussing it. So, for instance, we live in a historical period in which philosophy, which known as kind of neoliberalism, has had a profound impact, and that has definitely had an impact on the nature of government in South Africa in the post-apartheid period. People often talk, it's, I think, been highlighted again at the Zondo Commission over the last week or so, the issue of cadre deployment. and you know, and its impact. There's a tendency to some degree to identify our current problems in South Africa as being problems which kind of emanate from the kind of Zuma era. So it's almost as if things were going well in South Africa, but then you know, the Zuma administration came into power, and that's where things started going wrong. I'm inclined to put forward a different framework of analysis. The one thing is that we need to, you know, bring into this analysis our apartheid history, of course. So what we have and continue to have a system of racial inequality and exclusion. That system itself, the apartheid system, could be seen as the equivalent of or comparable to a legally authorized system of corruption and patronage, in which, you know, government used state resources to benefit one group of people at the expense of another group of people, and thereby, you know, and this was a means for governments to, you know, for a certain system of power to be maintained. And so then in the post-apartheid period, I have a certain view of what happened there, which is something along the following lines: that when the post-apartheid government came into power in the late 1990s, there was a pressing need for redress and racial justice. And one way for government to do this was through creating a more representative state. And so there was considerable emphasis placed on creating, you know, on changing the profile of government employees in kind of racial and gender terms. And also there was another benefit for the ruling party in that changing the profile of state employment also served to create a middle class, which was a means of securing a stable support base for the ruling party. But my understanding is that, and I mean, if one goes back at our history and you know, the circumstances in which you know, the democratic government came to power, it makes sense that government employment was used in this way. But I think that part of the problem was that these issues of representation were emphasized at the expense of the necessary focus on state capacity. And so the consequence of that has been that we've had a state which, on the one hand, for instance, has been much more vulnerable to corruption. It's also a state which has been, you know, while it's in some ways transformed in relation to its composition, hasn't been effectively able to contribute meaningfully to meeting many of these, you know, transformative social objectives. And so this question of how to, you know, move towards a state which is better able to contribute to meeting these kind of transformative social objectives is, in my understanding, one of the things that we need, you know, is a necessary part of this conversation about, you know, these challenges that we are facing. And so then, just by way of, you know, wrapping up there, you know, there's a number of levels then on which we could analyze this problem. The one thing is just that, you know, we could look at what are the kind of generators of conflict which are leading to these, you know, the need for public order policing and certain kinds of public order policing. And the one thing is that, as I've talked about, that the system of governance and related to it, the problem of corruption, are themselves kind of generators of conflict. They, in some ways, are kind of continuing to perpetuate and reinforce the problems of exclusion, which we have inherited from apartheid. On the other hand, we could look at the manner in which public order policing units themselves are responding to protest. So, for instance, when public order policing units use rubber bullets against members of the public who are peacefully protesting, this is itself contributes to antagonism to the police. It reinforces conflict and so on. So there's, you know, generators of conflict within the policing system and within, you know, the broader governance system. Then, you know, so in terms of responding to these problems, we can respond to them, you know, there's this, you know, obviously need for improvements in the public order policing system. But, you know, what I've argued then is that in order to purposefully, you know, have a kind of purposeful response to our problems of public order policing, we need to have, you know, sustained improvements of in our overall system of policing governance. On the issue of conflict resolution, also then just in terms of one of the issues that is discussed a bit in the panel report is, you know, the possibility of strengthening mechanisms for conflict resolution. And so, you know, one of the debates that was had within the panel was, you know, whether one wants to, for instance, there was a discussion about whether this is something about strengthening for instance, the CCMA, whether one needs to create other mechanisms for conflict resolution or so on. The one thing is that, you know, the framework that we have within public order policing, you know, it's already established that this idea of negotiated crowd management is supposed to be part of our framework for dealing with protest. And so, you know, and so there's, you know, would be questions about how to strengthen negotiated crowd management. And there's, for instance, models from other countries where, for instance, I think it's in Sweden, for instance, where they've developed dedicated negotiation units within the you know, policing system. Okay, so, but, you know, at the end of the day, then, you know, these problems are not problems which are going to be resolved or can be resolved simply through the policing system. We need to focus on our governance and corruption system. And so, you know, and so, for instance, if we're talking about the problem of corruption itself, that itself cannot simply be resolved through, you know, the orange overalls and so on. We need to strengthen our overall systems of public administration. And so, you know, that in order for, you know, the process of social transformation, which is what we committed ourselves to in you know, on 27 April 1994, you know, the institutional framework within which that is embedded needs to be put on kind of firmer ground in order for us to, you know, address these problems in a more sustained way. Okay, thank you. That's where I'm going to end.
Thanks so much, David. If you can just unshare your screen.
Okay, great.
There we go. Great. Thanks so much, David. A really insightful and interesting, detailed, but also fascinating presentation. So thank you so much for all the preparation that went into that. Also to Adele for your presentation, focusing on the less lethal ammunition, also raising a number of issues that just aren't discussed within the public domain. So I'm not going to talk much. I'm just really going to open the floor, open the room, the webinar for comments and questions. We have about 15 minutes because we have to end at 2 o'clock. So if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, I see we have a number of policing specialists, human rights specialists in the webinar. Please do use the raise their hand function, and then we'll take questions. If there's only one for the time being, we'll just take one and hand it back to the speakers. If we have a few, we'll take 3 or 4 questions or comments and give the speakers a chance to respond. And I just want to see a message popped up. Okay. Right, I see Mary Rayner's hand, then I've got Asanda Benya. So Mary, over to you, and then Asanda.
Thank you. Thanks very much to both speakers in their different ways, extremely helpful. I just had a quick one for Adele. When you were running through the list of dangers inherent, indiscriminate aspects, etc., to different weapons, I was very shocked when we were doing research on the consequences of stun grenades. We had a project on injuries caused to students back several years ago. And the extremity of the injuries to several individuals from exploded stun grenades was, I felt like you were in a war zone. Terrible bleeding, damage to the skin, and so forth. And the explanation for the fact that they'd been so badly injured was when the dispersal was signaled and people were running to get away from the police line, the weapon itself was thrown contrary to instructions instead of being rolled along the ground, which we'd been told should be the way it is managed. I don't have an independent opinion on that, but it was thrown over the heads of the fleeing students and exploded like a weapon, very close to the faces, the skin, the eyes, the ears of the victims. And we had a discussion with a senior police officer who actually was partly in the headquarters of the police and the pop section and so forth. And he repeated what the proper way was for the weapon to be thrown to avoid that kind of injury. But what you had was a line of police who were not thinking, were not properly managed, and the consequences for the individuals was terrible. And I just wondered whether, Adele, you're aware of any measures taken to ensure that a weapon like that could not be misused and should have consequences if it is misused. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary. Sunder, if you can just hang on. That's a very direct question for Adele, very specific question. So Adele, if you can address that question, then I'll give others a chance to ask questions and respond. So Mary, also, if you can just drop your hand for me, please. Thank you. Adele, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So I think it was one of the things we grappled with in the panel. In the national instruction, there are no guidelines on the use of stun grenades. The national instruction is silent on them. And I think, I guess just as you were talking, we're talking about they're less lethal weapons, but they are weapons. And so their potential for injury in and of themselves, even if used correctly, if they are not misfiring or if they are not defective. So the panel made a recommendation that there need to be very clear guidelines and regulations on the use of stun grenades. So that's a strong recommendation. Whether they've moved ahead with that or not, we know that the commanders are seriously, senior cops are seriously engaging with changes to the use and the components of rubber bullets and shotguns. So, this is something where we can put some pressure on SAPS to say, what is your approach to all of the less lethal weapons that you are using? And so to come at it holistically rather than piece by piece. Right now, there are not clear guidelines. And I guess, for SAPS officers, the key issue is the confusion for them about when and how they may or may not use, and in a way puts a burden on them that they should not be carrying.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adele. Next on my list, I've got Asanda Benya. Over to you, Asanda.
Thanks, Guy, and thanks to David and Adele for a very informative presentations. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. In 2012, shortly after the Marikana massacre, a couple of, and there were in the community, there were public order police people walking around, and one woman was shot and killed. Others were shot also, but Pauline in particular was killed. And the police kept saying, well, it was not because of these bullets, because these were rubber bullets. So I'm interested, how widely used in South Africa are these metal rubber bullets? Because we keep hearing the police making sort of excuses, I suppose, around whether they are responsible or not when someone dies in cases where they've used rubber bullets. So how widely used are the metal ones in particular, not so much the plastic, but also do they all cause the same kind of harm on people or incapacitate people to the same degree? I know, Adele, you mentioned that there are not a lot of studies, but from the few that are there, any thoughts on that? And the second question is around, again, rubber bullets in particular, because that's the one I'm very interested in. Are there any conditions where the use of these, not just all the less lethal weapons, but rubber bullets in particular, where their use can be justified and seen as legitimate in public order policing in a democratic country like ours, where protest is something that we should all enjoy? And then the third and maybe last question is for David around one of the controversial points that he raised around the acceptance of violence. And I'm wondering what his thoughts are on scholarship that's been produced that shows that actually it's not so much the acceptance of violence, but also it's that people do explore other avenues. They only go the violent protest route when they have not been, when they don't get attention. And it's also the fact that we only get to hear about some of these protests or so-called conflict resolution things when the media gets to them, right? So it's not that there's an acceptance of violence, but that's actually the only way that people get heard. And then the final one is around thoughts on from both Adele and David on, in the American circles, there's been lots of talks around defunding the police. And I'm wondering what they think about such a thing in South Africa and what that could look like in light of all of the challenges that they've raised. Thank you.
Thanks, Asanda. Daniel Benson has his hand up, so I'm just going to give Daniel a chance to answer his question. And then also Andrew Ford has a question sitting in the first thing specifically for Adele, sitting in the chat of Adele, if you can look at that. So I'm going to give Daniel a chance to speak, and then we'll give the floor back to Adele and David. So Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I'm Daniel Benson, yes, and I see here in my area, my concern is when must the police or pops, as we call them, start acting? Because you see people blocking the roads, people burning tires in the road. It means it's a state-owned thing, and then when I ask a question, are you not going to act? Then they say they're monitoring the situation. And then also they say they will act if there's violence or when there's when you what they call it, when you do something to buildings or things like that, then they will act. But you sometimes see they don't act, they are inactive, and I understand it. If they act, they're in trouble. If they don't act, they are also in trouble. But we have to have clarity about when they must act. The second one is a gathering act still the same, or if it changed? Because I hear also they say to gather or to march or something like that, protesting. It's a constitutional right. So it means anybody can. In the past, they must have permission to gather, and it must be, if it's more than a certain amount of people, then they must have permission from the municipality or so to gather or to strike or whatever. And I hear that is no more. It's anybody can go on a march or a gathering or something like that. So I just want to hear if the gathering. That's the two things of when must the police start acting, and is gathering, is the amendment in the Gathering Act. Thank you very much, Guy.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Thanks for your questions. I'm now going to hand back to the speakers. So David, if you don't mind responding first, and then after you will be Adele. So over to you, David. David, you're muted.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to sort of take on, just go through the questions and allow Adele to add. I mean, I sort of do have my own perspective on some of these questions. So, Asanda, as far as I know, there are not metal rubber bullets. I'm aware of the incident that you're referring to, as far as I understand it, was in the Marikana community where a woman was, as I understand, a shot in the knee, and I understand she died as a result of complications resulting from the wounds. And so, you know, I think, as Adele has said, the terminology that's used is that these are less lethal weapons. What's also then recognized is that the potential for injury is for fatal consequences is much greater when the weapons are used at close range, and particularly when they are used towards the upper part of the body, such as, you know, the head and so on. But nevertheless, you know, the situation is that there is a risk of fatality from these weapons. And as this example illustrates, it isn't only a risk of fatality when they are used against the upper body. So, you know, essentially you know, part of the answer to your question about the legitimate use of these weapons, and I think it speaks partly also to the issue that Daniel is raising, is, you know, one of the simple things that we could do. So there's, for instance, this idea which is carried over from, you know, the kind of history of crowd management and apartheid, but also I think internationally, is there's this idea that it's the role of the police to disperse a crowd, and that the role of these weapons is to disperse the crowd. But to some degree, I think what's recognized internationally more and more, certainly in some countries, is that when police use force against members of a crowd, it is in principle only really valid to use force against members of a crowd who themselves are acting in unlawful, in a violent way, particularly. And so, you know, there might be other situations, certain extreme situations, where it is legitimate for police to use force broadly against the members of the crowd for purposes of dispersal. But in general, the purpose for which force is used should be against specific individuals whose conduct justifies the use of force against them. And so people who are conducting themselves peacefully should not be seen as legitimate targets for the use of force. Asanda, in relation to your question about the kind of scholarship, you know, and so I'm aware of the scholarship, and, you know, as I said, it might be seen as a controversial point. I think, you know, the answer to that question is a nuanced answer, that there is research which shows that in many circumstances where there has been violence, it is kind of following repeated efforts by people to resolve the problems which they're facing in a non-violent manner. But nevertheless, I don't think that's necessarily the final word on the issue. I see, you know, it is still my impression that there is, to some degree, a culture within South Africa in which, people feel that violence is a kind of valid and legitimate way of conducting themselves during protest, and that to some degree it is something that is used, you know, where in terms of some kind of normative standards, it might be seen as not justified or necessary, and not as a last resort. Okay, I'm going to, I'm going to leave the question defunding the police because we're on our time limit. But just on the question of just one of Daniel's points, I just want to use a kind of terminological point. So the Regulations of Gatherings Act is still in force. There is, but it is not strictly correct to say that the Regulation of Gatherings Act requires that people had permission, obtained permission prior to carrying out a protest. What the Regulation of Gathering Act requires is that people notify the authorities prior to a protest. And so what there has been a recent court judgment, and I'm a bit worried that I'm going to get this wrong, but the court, well, it's now quite a few years ago, in fact, but the court judgment then provided that it was no longer a criminal offense if the organizers of a protest did not notify the authorities about a protest. And so that's where we stand. So there's a kind of, I think you're correct to say that there's is a level of legal uncertainty right at the moment, but nevertheless, the position has, is not one where people are required to get permission to protest. What has been the position is that they're required to give notice of a protest of more than 15 people in a public place. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. We're over time now, so if I can ask Adele if you can just give as brief as possible responses to the questions so we can bring this webinar to an end. So over to you, Adele. Thanks, David.
I will try and be brief, you know me. So just to say that, I think it raises again that the issue of context, of what kind of police we want, the issue of should it be fundamentally around the negotiations of crowd management. That means that the way we train cops has to fundamentally alter. And then it brings us into the question that Asanda raises, which is around defunding and the kind of abolitionist movement. And to say that there is some discussion happening in the anti-repression working group of the C19 People's Coalition. We are beginning to discuss it. We're reading some interesting stuff. Obviously, most of this is coming from within the US context, but I think there's appetite in South Africa to begin engaging on this. And, to say what would it look like in our context, given that there are some similarities in terms of how policing and violence is used against people, Black people in particular, but marginalized people with less access to resources, etc. So I think it's, I think it's something we need to be discussing much more, and certainly it's something that the anti-repression working group is looking at. But I wanted to say, just in ending, Guy, if I could, is that there's a website. It's called www.report.org.za, which is a website set up by the C19 People's Coalition, where people can report instances of police abuse of authority and repression and misuse of force.
Thanks, Adele. And we can certainly also feature that on SaferSpaces as well, because it's about initiatives and movements and social movements. So if you don't mind just sending me the link by email, and then we'll get in contact with whoever the relevant person is to put up a profile about this particular initiative. So thank you so much. So as we say, we're over time, so we have to bring this webinar to an end. So thank you so much to Adele and David for providing really interesting insights, but also to all of you who made the time to be here on a Friday afternoon, and also for some really good questions and comments. Thank you for that. I'd also encourage you to visit SaferSpaces. This is where this webinar recording is going to be posted with the other webinar recordings, but also there's other information that might be of use to you. And also just watch SaferSpaces and emails, because there will be other webinars between now and the end of June. So thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your weekend, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.